I stepped into a city I had never known, where the air carried scents of spice and dust, and the streets hummed with the rhythm of a life far older than mine. The walls were etched with history, the stones beneath my feet worn smooth by countless journeys. It was loud, voices calling, footsteps rushing, the restless murmur of commerce. And then something happened. The noise began to fade, not abruptly, but as if the world itself had been asked, gently, to listen. From somewhere unseen, a voice rose, steady and unshaken, unfolding into the sky. It was the call to prayer. It did not reach for my attention, yet it held me completely. There was no grand stage, no orchestra, no artifice, only a human voice, ancient and unbroken, carrying a weight I could feel in my chest. I did not know the language, but I knew the meaning. Some truths do not pass through the mind to reach you. They strike the heart directly. I saw the city change. A merchant's hand paused above his scale. A boy's laughter softened until it was no more than a breath. Strangers stood still, not in fear, not in obligation, but in recognition of something greater than themselves. For a moment, it felt as though every heartbeat moved to the same quiet rhythm, a rhythm older than the stones beneath us. And I felt it in my bones. It stirred questions I could not name, as though the sound had slipped past every defense I had built, touching something I had long ignored. When the voice faded, the city exhaled. Life returned, the footsteps, the wheels, the voices. But I was not the same. That echo stayed with me, not in my ears, but in the silent places within, where memory turns into something deeper. I came to that place as a stranger, but I left carrying something I could not explain, a question, a longing, a strange peace. I have not yet found all the answers, but I know this: beauty does not always arrive to be admired. Sometimes it comes to change you. And that night, in a city whose name I could barely pronounce, beneath a sky I had never seen before, I was changed. I arrived as the sun was folding itself into the horizon, bleeding gold and crimson into a sky already dimming with the promise of night. The air felt different here, thicker somehow, carrying with it the mingled sense of earth, spice, and smoke. The streets moved with a life all their own, winding and narrow, worn smooth by the weight of centuries. Each turn revealed something unexpected, a vendor calling out the price of his wares, the shimmer of brass lamps catching the last light, children darting between market stalls with the reckless freedom of youth. I walked slowly, not from fatigue, but from the weight of it all. Every corner seemed to whisper a story I could not yet understand. The buildings leaned toward one another like old friends sharing secrets, their walls patterned with cracks that spoke of age rather than neglect. Above them, clotheslines stretched across the gaps, heavy with fabric, that swayed in the breeze as though waving to a stranger who had just arrived. The city seemed both intimate and vast, an endless labyrinth that could cradle you in its alleys while reminding you of how small you truly are. The sounds were constant, yet oddly harmonious. The shuffle of sandals against stone, the distant rattle of a cart, the staccato rhythm of voices haggling over bread. Somewhere far off, a dog barked, its voice carrying through the warm air like an echo from another world. And yet, beneath the noise, there was something steady, an undercurrent of calm that I could not place. I felt it in the way the people moved, in the measured pace of their steps, in the way their eyes lingered, not in suspicion, but in quiet curiosity. It was a city alive with motion, but not in a hurry, a place that had learned the value of letting life unfold at its own pace. The colors deepened as night drew closer, burnished oranges and soft shadows stretching long across the cobblestones. Somewhere, a shopkeeper lit a lantern, and the warm glow spilled into the street like liquid amber. I found myself standing still, watching the way the light touched the stones, the way it made the air shimmer, as if holding its breath. I did not yet know what I was waiting for, but I could feel it. Something approaching, something just beyond the edge of sound and sight. I had come to this place, seeking nothing in particular, yet already it felt as though it was preparing to give me something I would never forget. It began without warning, as though the air itself had been quietly holding its breath, waiting for the exact moment to release it. I was mid-step, the noise of the street still swirling around me, voices rising and falling, the creak of wooden carts, the occasional burst of laughter. And then, from somewhere unseen, a sound emerged. It was not loud in the way a shout is loud, yet it carried farther, deeper, as though it belonged not only to the air, but to the very stones beneath my feet. The voice was steady, resonant, and unhurried. It rose like a ribbon through the dusk, unfurling across the rooftops, slipping between buildings, weaving itself into the folds of the city. It did not compete with the noise around it. Rather, the noise seemed to bow before it. Conversations thinned, footsteps slowed. Even the restless flapping of pigeons seemed to still. I could not understand the words, yet there was no mistaking their weight. There was no performance here, no pretense of impressing anyone who listened. It was a call, not to me specifically, but to anyone who had ears, to anyone whose heart still knew how to pause. I watched its effect. A man balancing a tray of bread paused mid-stride. A child, tugging at her mother's sleeve, stopped, asking her question. The sound moved over them like a tide, not sweeping them away, but drawing them inward, each in their own private stillness. Something in the tone felt older than time, like the voice of a memory I had never lived yet somehow recognized. It was both distant and intimate, as if it had traveled 1,000 years just to arrive in that exact moment, in that exact place in my hearing. The longer it lasted, the more I realized it was not just a sound, it was an atmosphere, a shift in the air itself. The city seemed to lean toward it, listening, and so did I. For the first time since I had arrived, I felt no need to move, no need to speak. I simply stood and listened as the voice carried me somewhere far beyond the streets where I stood. The voice flowed through the streets like a thread, binding together people who moments ago had been moving in their own separate directions. I stood and watched as this invisible thread wove them into something greater than the sum of their parts, a quiet tapestry of humanity unfolding before my eyes. There was no command for silence, yet silence came. There was no demand for stillness, yet stillness settled over the crowd as naturally as dusk follows daylight. A fruit vendor, his hands stained with the colors of his trade, leaned against his stall, eyes turned upward as though listening with more than his ears. Across the way, a group of laborers set down their tools, the clink of metal against stone marking the moment they chose to pause. A child clutched the hem of her father's shirt. Her earlier energy softened, as if she too sensed that this was a time for listening. It struck me how differently each person responded. Some closed their eyes, as if retreating inward to a private place. Others gazed outward, watching the horizon or the sky, perhaps imagining the voice's origin. Yet, for all their differences, there was an undeniable unity among them, an unspoken agreement. that this moment was shared. I realized then that what I was witnessing was more than a cultural practice or religious tradition. It was a living reminder of our common humanity. The voice spoke to them in words they understood, but it also spoke to me in a language beyond language. It reminded me that despite the walls we build between ourselves, whether of stone, of distance, or of belief, there are moments capable of reaching across them. In those few minutes, I felt less like an observer and more like a thread in the very fabric I was watching. The air seemed thicker with meaning, and I sensed that everyone there, from the merchant to the child to the stranger standing in the shadows, was bound together by something invisible yet unbreakable. And when the sound began to fade, I knew the connection would linger, as if some part of us had been quietly stitched together by the same ancient call. There was nothing ornate about the sound, no embellishment to distract from its essence. It was a single human voice, carrying a series of phrases that had been spoken in the same way for generations. No music accompanied it, no instruments lent it force, yet it filled the space more completely than any symphony could have. Its strength lay in its purity. Every note felt deliberate, every pause intentional, as if each breath had been shaped by centuries of devotion. I find myself struck by how little it needed in order to move me. We live in a world where volume and complexity often masquerade as depth, where we are surrounded by noise crafted to capture attention but not to nourish the soul. This was different. This was the opposite. The call asked for nothing, no applause, no acknowledgement, yet it held the power to still the pulse of an entire city. Even without understanding the words, I could feel their weight. There was a rhythm, not only in the sound itself, but in the silence it created. Each phrase rose and fell like the turning of a tide, and between them lay moments of quiet that seemed just as important as the words. It was in those brief silences that I felt the most something ancient and nameless. It made me realize how often the simplest things carry the deepest truths. A voice, a few repeated lines, the trust that what is being said matters enough to be spoken again and again without alteration, without adornment. In that moment, the city didn't need anything more than this sound to come together, to remember something beyond the demands of daily life. The call ended exactly as it began, without spectacle. The voice did not linger or swell for effect. It simply stopped, leaving behind an echo that seemed to rest in the air, in the stones, in the hearts of those who had listened. And perhaps that was the greatest proof of its power, that even when it was gone, its simplicity remained, quietly filling the space it had touched. As I stood there listening, I felt the sound turning inward, as though it were not simply filling the streets, but searching for something within me. It was strange how a voice, distant and unfamiliar, could feel as though it was speaking directly to a place I had long forgotten. There was no question in the words that I could discern, yet I felt questioned, not about facts or beliefs, but about the very state of my own being. It was as if the call held up a mirror, one that did not show my face, but my soul, and in that reflection I sensed both the weight of the years behind me and the fragile, uncertain shape of the years ahead. I thought of the hurried days I had lived, the noise I had accepted as normal, the endless list of things I chased without stopping to ask why. The voice did not condemn me for these things. It simply made me aware of them in a way that could not be ignored. In that moment, I remembered fragments, faces I had not seen in years, places where the air had felt equally still, moments of silence I had once cherished, but allowed to be buried under the clutter of life. The call seemed to gather those scattered pieces and hold them before me, asking, without words, "What have you done with what you were given?" It wasn't an accusation, it was more like an invitation, a chance to step outside of myself and see clearly, if only for a moment. I realized that the questions it stirred were not meant to be answered in that instant. They were seeds, meant to be carried to grow in their own time. Around me others stood in their own quiet, perhaps wrestling with their own reflections, or perhaps simply resting in the peace the sound brought. I did not know. But I knew what it had done to me. It had reached past every surface layer I present to the world and touched the place where words lose their usefulness. When the voice faded, the mirror did not. I could still feel it. Clear, unflinching, and yet somehow gentle, waiting for me to keep looking long after the sound was gone. Even after the final note dissolved into the night, the space it had occupied did not close. The streets returned to motion. Footsteps resumed their rhythm. The rattle of carts returned. Voices rose again. But it was as though a thin veil had been drawn over everything. The sound was gone, yet it remained, not in the air, but in the mind, in the heart, in some hidden chamber where echoes refused to die. I walked on, and the city moved around me, yet every turn of the street, every flicker of lantern light seemed touched by what I had heard. It was not the melody I carried, nor the exact cadence of the words, but the stillness they had left behind, a stillness that seemed to hum softly, like a memory that knows it will not fade. It made me think about how certain moments do not end when they are over. They stay folded into the fabric of who you are. You carry them the way you might carry the scent of a fire on your clothes long after you've stepped away from the flames. You do not try to hold them. They simply stay. And perhaps that is why this echo felt so alive, because it did not ask to be remembered. It simply insisted on being part of me now. Every sound I heard in the city from that point on seemed changed. The shuffle of sandals on stone had a gentler rhythm. The low murmur of conversation felt as if it carried more patience. Even my own breath seemed slower, as though the echo had persuaded me to take more of the world in with each inhale. I did not try to speak about it to anyone. How could I? To explain it would be to strip it of its shape, to reduce it to something smaller than it was. So I kept it to myself, letting it live in the quiet spaces between thoughts. And I knew that in some unspoken way, I would always carry this night with me. Not because I wanted to, but because it had woven itself into me. And echoes, when they are true, do not fade. I came to that city a stranger, carrying nothing but curiosity and the restless hunger that pushes us toward places we do not know. I did not expect to be stopped, not by sight or spectacle, but by a single voice calling into the dusk. I did not expect it to slow the world around me, or to turn my thoughts inward, or to leave a mark I could not see, but could feel in every quiet moment afterward. What I heard that night was not merely a call to prayer. It was a call to stillness, to reflection, to something greater than the clamor of our daily lives. It was proof that the simplest things can hold the deepest truth, that unity can rise at a difference, and that beauty can reach us even when we do not understand its language. I left those streets the same way I entered them, yet changed in ways that are difficult to name. The echo followed me, not as a memory to be stored away, but as a reminder, one that speaks without sound, urging me to pause, to listen, and to remember that there are moments in this world capable of touching the soul without ever asking for permission. Somewhere, even now, that voice is rising again, over rooftops, threading through streets, calling people to gather, to remember, to be still. And though I am far from it, a part of me is still standing there in that night air, listening.